A warm welcome back to the channel, everyone. My name is Karen Saunders. In today's discussion, I'm going to be covering an area that's not really spoken about, and yet more and more people are starting to experience the effects. What am I talking about? I'm talking about religious trauma syndrome, or RTS, and how it is linked very closely with spiritual abuse. Last year I did an online exam and gained a certificate in religious trauma syndrome on top of my mental health background, just to understand what it's like for people going through this particular trauma. Many times when somebody is suffering, they will go along to their GP and they will talk about their symptoms, which can invariably come across as anxiety driven. So what tends to happen is that the person suffering from religious trauma syndrome will actually just get referred to a counsellor or a psychologist who specialises in anxiety. What I've found here in Australia is that there are not many people who are qualified in religious trauma syndrome or religious trauma therapy for the person that's suffering from the syndrome. So from last year, I'm going to be using some notes just to talk you through this area of trauma, and you can use it as a resource or maybe refer to it when you need to update your understanding. And please also share with other people that you feel may be struggling with religious trauma syndrome. So let's get into it. What is religious trauma syndrome, or RTS? Well, this refers to a psychological and emotional distress experienced by individuals who have been negatively impacted by harmful religious beliefs, practices, or environments. And as I've just mentioned, religious trauma syndrome, or RTS, it is actually not an official diagnosis. Not yet. It's not in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, or the DSM-5, for mental disorders. Nevertheless, it is widely recognised by mental health professionals as a real and debilitating condition. What are the common causes of RTS? Well, let's break this down into points. There's several points that I want to cover. The first one is authoritarian control. What do I mean by that? Well, authoritarian control shows up as strict, oppressive, religious environments that demand conformity and discourage questioning. Fear-based teachings. Emphasis on concepts like hell, eternal damnation, or divine punishment flag up under fear-based teachings, which reinforces a person's or a sufferer's belief that they need to adhere to those teachings in order to be saved. Another aspect of RTS is shaming and guilt, instilling feelings of worthlessness or sinfulness. So, for example, if somebody went out and decided that they didn't want to believe what they were taught anymore, but wanted to go and see other religions or read up about other belief systems, they might be shamed or guilt tripped into doing that by the religion or the environment that they were in previously. Another aspect is isolation. Separation from non-believers or family members who do not conform. So again, this re-emphasises to the person that's been traumatised that to have anything to do with friends or family who don't believe, you are actually sinning or you could be disappointing God for not cutting ties. That's one example. And then, of course, abuse. That could be physical, emotional, sexual, or spiritual abuse perpetrated by religious authorities or within religious communities. What are the symptoms of RTS? Well, the psychological symptoms include anxiety, depression, or panic attacks, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, symptoms, for example, like intrusive thoughts or nightmares, recurring nightmares. And of course, intrusive thoughts never go away, and the sufferer doesn't know how to, get off the carousel, psychologically speaking. So that can be quite traumatic for the individual. Emotional symptoms, again, we've covered guilt, shame, fear-related attacks on that person to the religious teachings, feelings of loss, grief, or betrayal after leaving a faith. Also, a person can experience anger or resentment toward religious institutions or figures, because once a person goes into therapy and they start recognizing what's happened to them, then of course anger and resentment flag up in that person's life. Going to therapy isn't the end of the matter. Actually, it's only the beginning of a person's journey in trying to break free from the mind control and the indoctrination. There are cognitive symptoms as well that are experienced. A person could experience confusion. They could have difficulty making decisions and obsessive thoughts, which could also be linked in with the intrusive thoughts, which, off the, just saying it might not seem anything big, but intrusive and obsessive thoughts are actually very, very painful to the individual because they're ongoing and there never seems to be a break. It's relentless. So therapy and therapeutic interventions are absolutely crucial at this stage for the sufferer. Also, people are still struggling with fear of divine punishment even after leaving the religion and starting their therapeutic journey. They still struggle with identity and what their worldview is. It's so skewed at this point. And I remember personally speaking from my own experience when I left the Jehovah's Witnesses last year and coming out of the organisation that I'd been in for 35 years. It was just traumatic for me. I didn't know where to go, who to turn to, what to believe in, and I ended up inadvertently joining an ex-Jehovah's Witness Bible study group who, now I'm out of it, for me it was like jumping out of the pan into the fire. In fact, they are still very Jehovah's Witness inclined with their teachings and the way that they drive fear and guilt into people as well, saying things like, if you leave our Bible study group, you're not a true child of God. You're only a true child of God if you join our Bible study group. So I think you will gather who I'm talking about after all the interviews that I've done on this channel. Also, there's physical symptoms. We shouldn't overlook the physical symptoms of religious trauma. They can actually include stress-related issues like headaches, fatigue, or even digestive problems. So indoctrination and brainwashing of a religion really does mess with the person in so many ways, psychologically, physically, mentally, and so forth. So it's really, really crucial and important that the sufferer gets the correct intervention from the correct professional. How does somebody cope with religious trauma? Well, of course, as I've just outlined, they need to seek therapy. Seek a therapist who understands religious trauma. Therapies like cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, or trauma-focused therapy can help. But here's what I want to point out, friends. As I've said before, there are not enough people, there are not enough professionals, counsellors, psychologists. They're not trained in RTS. They might understand things like anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and so forth, but they're not trained in religious trauma therapy, which is underpinned by spiritual abuse. As I've said, a person seeking religious trauma intervention can go along to their GP, and the GP is not trained in religious trauma therapy either. And so what happens is, when a sufferer explains their symptoms, the GP will just write it off as anxiety or chronic depression, and will just refer that person to a psychologist or a counsellor who is not qualified or certainly done any research on religious trauma syndrome. Another important aspect for a sufferer is to find their community, join a support group with others who have experienced similar struggles. You can join, Christian groups or other, secular recovery groups. But again, caution is really needed, because you don't want to be jumping out of the pan into the fire. For me personally, I had to educate myself on religious trauma therapy or religious trauma syndrome, what spiritual abuse was coming out of this organisation of Jehovah's Witnesses. And so there's plenty of good online websites and references and resources that you can access that can actually help you deal with religious trauma and then disconnect from harmful beliefs through reading. I know I love reading, I love researching. You can listen to really good qualitative podcasts or videos to educate yourself before you even, enter into therapy or join a community group. I think at this point as well, self-compassion, self-nurture, mind therapy is really, really important, and it's a practice. We need to practice self-care. We need to practice mindfulness and self-compassion and self-nurture because of what we've been through. This isn't about being, self-absorbed. This is about looking after yourself and affirming your worth and who you are outside of any religious framework. Boundaries. Boundaries are always welcome in the life of somebody who's gone through, excessive trauma. And the need to set boundaries with other individuals or groups that perpetrate trauma is an absolute must for the person suffering from religious trauma syndrome. In fact, if you don't put boundaries in place, then you could be taken advantage of in so many ways. It's really important, friends. So I mentioned spiritual abuse. Religious trauma syndrome and spiritual abuse are closely linked, because spiritual abuse is often a key contributor to the development of religious trauma syndrome. So here's how they're connected. Let's do the breakdown. Spiritual abuse is probably the #1 cause of religious trauma syndrome, because it involves the misuse of religious authority. I'm talking about the perpetrator now. Practices or beliefs common to many people, but they're designed to control, manipulate, or harm others. Spiritual abuse often takes place in high control religious environments or authoritarian groups. And when individuals experience prolonged spiritual abuse, it can lead to the psychological and emotional damage that defines RTS or religious trauma syndrome. So what are some common forms of spiritual abuse? Control and coercion, Leaders demand unquestioning obedience, instilling fear of punishment for dissent. Second, guilt and shame. This comes under the teaching that adherents are inherently sinful or unworthy without faith. Third, fear-based beliefs. Threats of eternal damnation or divine retribution or punishment or ostracism for questioning or leaving a religion or a religious group that is actually enforcing their beliefs and doctrines onto you. Fourth, isolation. Cutting individuals off from family, friends or non-believers to maintain control. You can also link narcissistic behaviour in with that, because when leaders or authoritarian groups instill isolation, they then use the pitting and splitting to conquer and divide individuals from families and friends. They'll also use what we call smear campaigns to use or employ gossiping techniques to malign the reputation of the one that's trying to leave the religion or the religious community. And then we have the fifth point, exploitation. Religious leaders, community group leaders and other people, even individuals, they will demand time, money or services under the guise of spiritual devotion. So for example, a community religious leader might do a YouTube channel, and they will at every opportunity ask for donations, and they'll say that the donations actually go to further their channel, when in actual fact most of the donations, if not all of them, go towards living a luxurious lifestyle. This is true, friends. So spiritual abuse and the link to RTS symptoms often creates conditions for trauma by violating a person's autonomy, and their sense of safety and identity also is affected. Over time, this can cause the symptoms associated with religious trauma syndrome. So, what are some of the examples of how spiritual abuse leads to RTS? Well, there's emotional manipulation. Fear of hell or divine wrath can create chronic anxiety even after leaving the faith. Then we have identity erosion, being told that you are nothing without your faith, or that doubt is sinful, can lead to confusion and difficulty forming a new identity. These are terrible manipulative tactics used by people in authority who should know better, so they know what they're doing. And then, of course, we have the broken relationships. Abusive environments often demand cutting ties with outsiders, causing loneliness and loss when one leaves the group. And in many instances, people end up taking their lives because the problem outweighs the solution. There are also trust issues. Betrayal by religious leaders or institutions can result in difficulty trusting others, including non-religious organisations or communities and in non-religious contexts. So the ripple effect from leaving or being indoctrinated and brainwashed and then leaving that organisation or community can have really catastrophic effects on the emotion and well-being of the individual that's suffering from religious trauma. There are key differences, however, between RTS and spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse refers to the actions and behaviours inflicted on a person within a religious or spiritual context. RTS, or religious trauma syndrome, is the result of prolonged exposure to these abusive practices, manifesting as psychological, emotional, and physical symptoms. Can a person heal from both? Eventually, yes. It begins with acknowledging and naming the abuse in the first step to healing. Educating oneself about the dynamics of spiritual abuse and religious trauma can help deconstruct harmful beliefs. And as I've touched on and gone into as well, therapy, especially therapy with professionals who are knowledgeable about religious trauma, they can help address the deep-seated effects of RTS. So there you have it, friends. I've broken that down into some categories and subcategories of how religious trauma syndrome and spiritual abuse are interconnected, but they are different. So it's really important that we understand both concepts, because when they come together in a person that's suffering, it's very, very painful and very complex. If you'd like to reach out and talk about religious trauma syndrome, or if you think that you're experiencing religious trauma syndrome as a result of spiritual abuse, please contact me at welcomejesustoday@gmail.com, or you can WhatsApp me on the number that I'll give in the description link. I'll also put some references in there as well that you can read up on, connecting you to the understanding of religious trauma syndrome and spiritual abuse. Until next time, friends, please take care of one another. Always show kindness and love. Forgive those who hurt you. Forgive those who are cruel and say hurtful things and treat you in a not very nice way. Always remember, it's about where that person's at, not you. So never ever lower yourself to be like the person who sets out to hurt you, upset you, and try and make your life a misery. Just break away from those people and find your family, find your tribe. That might be just one or two individuals that completely get you, that will love you unconditionally, that will accept you with open arms, as I do on this channel. And always think of others who are going through these things. There are many people out there who are in this situation. I love every single one of you. Take care now, until next time.